If we're going to talk about reparations, it should be the other way around. Other nations should be talking about how much they owe to Britain.
Well, actually, Britain's a great country and has done incredible things for the world. Right.
The abolition of slavery and the slave trade is often cited as one of the proudest moments in British history. Britain certainly wasn't the first nation to abolish it, nor would it be the last, but Britain's abolition was followed by a concerted effort to end it worldwide.
First empire in history that ended slavery. It ended slavery. It didn't invent it, it ended it. Slavery was the norm. And then the British came along, practiced slavery just like everybody else, and a terrible thing it was. And then they spent a tremendous amount of blood, money, and treasure to end slavery not only within the British Empire, they spent a huge amount of diplomatic, military, and financial capital to force other countries to end slavery in those countries as well.
Well, if we're going to talk about reparations, what we should really be talking about is how much these nations, the Caribbean nations and the African nations, owe to Britain. And why
Britain actively promoted the abolition of slavery internationally. Britain used its political and economic influence to pressure other nations to abolish slavery, and it signed treaties with various countries to enforce anti-slavery measures.
It was the British people that ended the global slave trade. Not just the British Empire's slave trade, but the entire global slave trade. And how did we do it? Well, with blood and with treasure.
What really bothers me is Frankie Boyle's attempt to make British people feel ashamed of Britain's involvement in the slave trade.
Yes, as is often pointed out, the British did pay a lot of the slave owners compensation. That did happen. But do you really think that the freed slaves actually cared that much? I doubt it.
The British Empire's anti-slavery policies had a significant impact on global attitudes and contributed to the decline of the slave trade and slavery worldwide.
That really gets my goat, because Britain's involvement in the slave trade is one of the most proud accomplishments of British history. And I know what you're thinking, oh my goodness, slavery is bad. And that's correct, which is why the British ended it. For everyone. If we just take a cursory look at the subject, you can see how it is not nearly as cut and dried as Frankie makes it out to be.
So, as you can see, it's wild out there. This, unfortunately, is the new norm. The wild, wild west, in a way. This is the new UK, a place where people believe not only that colonialism and imperialism is a good thing, but that Britain should be congratulated for the ending of the slave trade. You couldn't make this up. To me, that's analogous to saying that we should thank the South African Boer government for the ending of apartheid. You know what's actually funny? It was really difficult for me to come up with an analogy for that didn't involve the British. It's almost like every outrageous atrocity is somehow connected to the British in recent times. Honestly, I struggled. And the only one I could think of is, the big H that happened in Europe, but obviously that would get me probably demonetized, so I like to leave that out of this discussion. But you get the picture. So where should we be landing with this entire discussion that surrounds the British slavery, colonialism? Well, that's why this video is here. In this video, we're going to discuss the history of slavery and the real reason why slavery ended in the British Empire. In 1833, the British Parliament passed the Slavery Abolition Act, and for generations since have positioned themselves as the moral leader in recognising the humanity of enslaved people and ending the brutality of the transatlantic slave trade. At least that's the version of the tale that they tell you. But this carefully cultivated narrative, now embedded in textbooks, political narrative, and as you can see in media discourse and in our education systems, hides a far more troubling and complex past. In fact, one of the issues is that the 1833 Slavery Abolition Act was not the first act to end the slave trade. It was the second, and there's a backstory to that. You see, the abolition of slavery was not some kind of altruistic moral awakening that suddenly came over the British government, who had been more than happy to indulge in its murderous exploits for economic gains. But actually, it was a calculated, economic and financially beneficial decision for a minority of the people in leadership in Britain. And actually, if you're willing to engage in this tale for a little while, you're going to see the parallels between what went on in 1833 and what is going on today, and how actually it's the same people who benefited 200 years ago from human bondage who are benefiting today from global human suffering. Indeed, today we're going to examine the real reasons behind the abolition of slavery. And these reasons are far removed from the humanitarian facade that history has allowed Britain to hide behind. Indeed, this is a story of financial calculations, of shifting global markets, and of political self-preservation, and of a nation that managed to end slavery whilst simultaneously entrenching the wealth that it had accumulated and amassed over centuries of exploitation and brutalization of a majority of the world's population, and concentrate that wealth into the hands of a few. Sound familiar? By the late 18th century, the foundations of British slavery was beginning to crack. The sugar plantations of the Caribbean, once the crown jewels of the British Empire, were beginning to face financial redundancy. Jamaica, Britain's most valuable colony, provides a stark example of this financial profitability crisis.
Records from 1775 to 1807 show sugar production dropping by nearly 15%, despite an increase in the enslaved population. Centuries of intensive cultivation had depleted the soil, while competition from newer French colonies in Saint-Domingue, with more fertile land, undercut British sugar prices. The ledgers of Jamaican plantation owner Thomas Hibbert reveal the economic reality. By 1800, his profit margins had fallen from 8 to 10% in the 1760s to barely 3 to 4%. Similar accounts from plantations across Barbados and Antigua tell the same story, diminishing returns on an increasingly expensive system. Jamaican sugar faced increasing competition from other producers, notably Cuba, Brazil, and the French colonies, where production was more efficient and costs were lower. This competition led to a significant drop in sugar prices, with estimates indicating a 56.8% decline between 1800 and 1834. Having officially and decisively lost its grip on the American colonies just decades prior, during the 1775 War of Independence, Great Britain's only real remaining slave colonies were in the Caribbean. And thanks to growing global competition, these precious remaining enslaved populations were, broadly speaking, no longer profitable. Great Britain was faced with the increasingly daunting reality of falling behind the rest of the world. These dire circumstances required a drastic change of tact.
But the economic calculation wasn't just about declining yields. New sources of sugar were popping up, particularly in the 1800s when European beet sugar production provided a tangible and viable alternative to sugarcane production in the Caribbean. The difference being that the production of European beet sugar didn't have the backdrop of colonial conflicts and the constant disruption of slave rebellions and uprisings, which were beginning to bring the Caribbean slave plantations to their knees. In other words, it was expensive, unprofitable, and increasingly dangerous to keep a population, a growing population of enslaved people. Slavery, at least in the Caribbean, had reached its natural apex, and it just made sense to call this failed experiment in human trafficking to a close. I'm going to put aside the fact that many of the people enslaved in the Caribbean were actually British nationals. That's another conversation for another day. But Britain never really had full control of its slave colonies, particularly the ones in the Caribbean. And actually ending slavery for many would have been a relief more than anything. Influential economists like Adam Smith were already arguing that free labour was more productive and less costly than enslaved labour.
In his 1776 work, The Wealth of Nations, Smith wrote that the work done by freemen comes cheaper in the end than that performed by slaves. This wasn't a moral argument, but a financial one. Free labour required less oversight, less coercion, and ultimately less capital investment. The costs of maintaining the system were also rising dramatically. Between 1791 and 1804, the successful Haitian Revolution sent shockwaves through the British Empire, plantation owners faced increasing security costs to prevent similar uprisings, while insurance rates for slave ships skyrocketed by as much as 30% between 1790 and 1807. Not coincidentally, during the same period of time, the biggest insurers of slave ships hailed almost exclusively from the UK. These companies were headquartered in London and Liverpool, such as Lloyd's of London. In spite of the 1807 Slave Trade Act banning the movement of slaves, particularly across the Atlantic, while slavery remained legal, British insurance companies like Lloyd's continued to profit from slave ship insurance for markets in Britain, Spain, Portugal, France, the Netherlands and the US. All losses from the reduction of slaving activity from the trade's final abolition were mitigated by the subsequent increase in insurance rates and lucrative new maritime contracts formed with the British military, whose Royal West Africa Squadron were tasked with policing the Atlantic. British companies profited on either side of the abolition.
Okay, so if you've made it this far into the video, I'm going to assume you've hit the like button. I mean, you're probably enjoying the video, so let's work together here. Meanwhile, Britain's economy was transforming. The Industrial Revolution was creating new centres of wealth and power. Textile manufacturers in Manchester and London needed cotton, not sugar, and they needed a market for their goods, not enslaved colonies. So the whole industry of colonialism and colonial extraction was beginning to have a diminishing return for the future of the British Empire. Industrial capitalists were beginning to see slavery as more of an impediment to their future rather than a benefit. Actually, I feel like this would be a really good point to segue into another topic that's very integral to this discussion. Have you heard of primitive accumulation? I mean, didn't you ever wonder why your family aren't growing their own fruit and veg and living off their own inherited land? Well, this one subject is one of the most instrumental factors that had brought Britain to this point. I actually think it's one of the most transformative crimes that have been committed against the British people, and yet it is all but omitted from our history books and from British textbooks. There might even be some historians, British historians, who are not familiar with this process called primitive accumulation.
In his 1867 book, Capital: Critique of the Political Economy, Karl Marx writes, "The accumulation of capital presupposes surplus value. Surplus value presupposes capitalist production. Capitalist production presupposes the availability of considerable masses of capital and labor power in the hands of commodity producers. The whole movement, therefore, seems to turn around in a never-ending circle, which we can only get out of by assuming a primitive accumulation, which precedes capitalist accumulation. Primitive accumulation refers to the historical processes that laid the foundations for wealth accumulation, or capitalism, not through thrift or industriousness, but through violence and coercion. Marx puts it bluntly: capital comes dripping from head to foot, from every pore, with blood and dirt. Nowhere is this more clearly illustrated than in the enforcement of Britain's Enclosure Acts, a series of laws passed in England primarily between the 16th and 19th centuries that privatized once common land, used collectively by rural communities, into the ownership of a wealthy political class of landowners. With the full backing of the state, these new landowners used violence and coercion to drive disenfranchisement, transforming those with customary, ancestral or informal access rights to common lands into landless peasants, no longer legally able to live, farm, and feed themselves in their own communities. This theft, disguised as law, of common and ancestral lands, had profound effects on Britain's rural population. For example, in Northamptonshire, between 1760 and 1810, over 150,000 acres were enclosed through parliamentary acts. These enclosures often displaced the rightful local landholders and a community of common rights users. Villages disappeared overnight as the proletariat, who were unable to afford the legal costs or meet the new fencing requirements, were forced to sell off, abandoning their homes and holdings. Most were forced to migrate to the growing urban centres, such as London, and it was this coercion that caused the swelling of the ranks of the working class. This was the creation of the free wage labourers, who remain essential for the success of capitalism. The Enclosure Act of 1773, for instance, allowed private landowners to initiate enclosure without the unanimous consent of other commoners who used the land. Instead, a petition supported by a majority of wealthy landowners alone was sufficient. Critically, this disregarded the rights of the populace, in many ways mirroring the scramble for Africa that would follow in 100 years. The Enclosure Act of 1773 and the many acts that followed prove Marx's idea of primitive accumulation not as a peaceful evolution, but as a violent transformation of social relations, using law as a tool of oppression and dispossession. And the land reforms catalyzed a continual cycle of wealth and capital accumulation that persists to this day. The British Empire provided a seamlessly profitable transition away from the increasingly dangerous practice of forced enslavement to the relative stability of wage-dependent industrial labour.
At the start of the video, you said 1833 was when the Slavery Abolition Act was passed. Well, that was the second Abolition Act. Britain already had one before, the 1807 Act to end the slave trade, but that didn't end slavery. And really, it didn't actually end the trading of slaves. It just stopped the movement of slaves in and out of Britain's colonies, i.e. slaves could move within the British Empire and be enslaved within the British Empire legally with no problem, but it banned the import and export of slaves. Now, there's a very significant reason why they passed the first Slave Trade Act, and it's not what you think. By 1807, when Britain abolished the slave trade, although not slavery itself, the economic impetus had already been set and the economics of slavery had already shifted. You see, Britain was pivoting from a mercantile empire to an empire that was dependent on its captive colonial markets, quite similar to France's relationship to the Francophone African nations, very much dependent on the wealth that was being generated within those nations for its own internal growth. You see, the system that had helped to build Britain's wealth had now become an obstacle to its ongoing growth and its desire for global economic dominance. In 1833, when Britain finally abolished slavery with the Slavery Abolition Act, it came with a huge financial compensation of £20 million, not for the millions of enslaved victims, but rather for the 46,000 slave owners who were compensated for their loss of property.
In 2008, as financial markets collapsed and banks teetered on the edge of failure, the British government stepped in with £500 billion of taxpayer money, with the estimated cost to the taxpayer rising to £1.2 trillion as of March 2010. This was done to save the institutions deemed too big to fail.
That regulation of the banks was not enough, but that there was a moral dilemma at the heart of this banking crisis, in that financial and banking institutions knew that they were too big to fail, and that the taxpayer, whether in the United Kingdom or in any of the other regions of Europe, would always have to help them out, no matter what the crisis.
The public would later face decades of austerity paid for by service cuts and extreme tax hikes to pay for it. Now, let's rewind 187 years. Britain finally abolished slavery throughout its empire in 1833, making the practice illegal, but it came with an extraordinary provision that reveals more about the true motives behind the act. For a stipulation of the abolition was the provision of a gargantuan payout totaling to a staggering 40% of the national GDP. The government provided £20 million, estimated to be worth multiple billions in today's currency, in compensation. This was paid not to the people who had been enslaved, but to the 46,000 slave owners to compensate them for loss of property. Now, aside from the glaring injustice of it all, the parallels should be obvious, eerie, and unsettling. If the crossovers aren't immediately obvious by now, they will become clearer. This is a summary of some notable modern organizations who were direct beneficiaries of the immense and unjust 1833 payout. The data was collated from the UCL Legacies of British Slave Ownership database, which documents all 46,000 compensation claims and their connections to modern institutions. Barclays Bank founder David Barclay, who was involved in the slave trade, did, over time, become a legitimate abolitionist. However, by the time of the 1833 compensation payout, several individuals associated with the bank, particularly its directors and shareholders, were among those who benefited from the compensation scheme for enslaved people on plantations. Founded as Taylors and Lloyds in Birmingham in 1765, the Lloyds banking group merged with the London and Westminster Bank, which had merged with the London Joint Stock Bank, founded by John William Lubbock, who received substantial compensation. Through these mergers, the bank has numerous connections to families who received substantial compensation for slaves. The Royal Bank of Scotland, founded in 1727, had several founders and early directors involved in colonial trade. They went on to acquire Smith, Payne and Smith Bank, which had received substantial slave payment compensation. HSBC acquired the UK's Midland Bank, now HSBC UK. Midland Bank's predecessor institutions, the London Joint Stock Bank, had direct associations with slave compensation. Amongst these were individuals such as George Pollard, the bank's first manager, director Thomas Philpotts, who together were involved in multiple compensation claims related to nearly 1,000 enslaved people enslaved across Nevis and Jamaica respectively. Tate and Lyle, founded by Henry Tate just after the compensation payouts, built their business on numerous sugar enterprises and plantations that had benefited from the compensation system. Mining companies Rio Tinto and BHP, both founded after the abolition to coincide with colonial settling and the new focus on labour exploitation and resource extraction, were both financed by bodies of direct investment capital from individuals whose wealth was derived from slavery plantations and large compensation payouts. Retailer Greene King, founded in 1799 by Benjamin Greene, owned plantations in Montserrat and St. Kitts. Greene received substantial amounts in direct compensation. The West India Dock Company, now part of Canary Wharf Group, established in 1799, was created specifically to handle trade from West Indian slave plantations and had many shareholders who received substantial compensation. Now, the British government, who did not have the astronomical £20 million sum available, were forced to borrow £15 million of it in a major loan from private bankers. The loan itself was arranged by two of the most powerful financiers in London, Nathan Meyer Rothschild and Moses Montefiore, who together represented two of the most prominent Jewish banking heritages. Their families also happened to be, joined by marriage, were called upon to issue the loan as government bonds and act as intermediaries, underwriting the bonds and managing public subscriptions. The government then paid interest on this debt through general taxation, resulting in repayments that took just shy of 2 centuries to clear. The £20 million compensation paid to slave owners under the 1833 Slavery Abolition Act remained the largest government payout in British history until the 2008 bankers' bailout, and it irreversibly reshaped the distribution of wealth in the UK's financial system. The open defrauding of the British taxpayer to award a morally decrepit minority of elites with exorbitant and undeserving wealth, it was this grandiose act of injustice that fabricated the fiscal bridge to progress Britain from a slave economy to an industrial empire, transferring wealth, deepening inequality, but also catalyzing major sectors of 19th century economic growth for a minority. But that's not all. There is an even more startling parallel that links the two events that some of you may have already noticed. Shockingly, At least 4 of the UK's major financial institutions benefited from not one, but both the slavery compensation payout and the more recent bankers' bailout. It seems in 175 years, one of the things understood by these banking institutions was that with enough lobbying influence and a convincing enough narrative, taxpayers' money can be gifted to private institutions, regardless of how deplorable their business practices might be. The Royal Bank of Scotland, Lloyds Bank, HSBC UK and Barclays, who each received billions in 2008, also received huge payouts directly and indirectly in slave compensation. Both events represent massive transfers of public resources to established wealthy institutions using unjust justifications about their economic necessity. It's important to remember that whilst the slave trade made the colonizing nations rich, it was the slavery compensation payouts that centuries ago granted many already rich individuals access to transformational and generational wealth.
Now, this massive transfer of wealth didn't just preserve the wealth of slave owners, it transformed them into virtual oligarchs. And it was this theft from poor to rich, sound familiar, that then went on to fund the Industrial Revolution and to place these oligarchs at the helms of various organizations where they still remain to this day. This compensation money flowed into railway companies, insurance companies and banks, mining companies, all of the above. Meanwhile, the formerly enslaved people received nothing, nada, zilch. In fact, under the apprenticeship scheme, they were forced to work for an additional 6 years, unpaid, to help to ease the transition of the former slave owners into this brave new world. Since, the payouts, they probably needed a cushion to take them from slave ownership to industrialization. This transition gave them the time that they needed to adapt to whatever their new business ventures were. Yeah, you can't make this stuff up. The abolition of slavery didn't end Britain's economic exploitation of people globally. It just transformed it into this completely new monster. And here's the kicker. Abolition actually became the convenient moral justification for the rapid expansion of colonialism across the British Empire. The former British Empire, where all of these innocent populations of people were violently thrust upon, genocided, enslaved and put to work by the British, were now transformed into markets, colonies, and were forced to essentially take British product in every way, shape or form, and also provide those former slave owners with an almost unbroken, uninterrupted source of low-wage labour. With slavery now officially ended, Britain could now position itself within its growing empire as the civilizing force to stem the shores of the chaos that she herself had started, whilst continuing to extract wealth through resource exploitation, unequal trade relationships, and of course, cheap, near enough free labour. Hello and welcome to my Kickstarter. If you're a subscriber to the King's Monologue on either YouTube, Instagram or TikTok, then you probably know who I am already. But for those of you who are new, first of all, thank you for actually coming here and viewing my proposal. Secondly, my name's Andrew, and let me take you through my project.
We only get a few opportunities during our lifetimes to really make a lasting positive impact and contribution. A few years ago, when I founded the King's Monologue, I didn't know I was making one of those choices. I only knew there was a huge difference between what I understood about our true history and what was being taught about it in schools and across the media. Fast forward to 2025, and thankfully I've been able to impact tens of millions of people about the true authentic history in Africa and beyond. My research has created discourse, stoked controversy and courted arguments, but ultimately, I have unapologetically provided balanced and well-supported refutations against a false historical narrative, whitewashed and gate-kept by centuries of Western academic racial bias. The King's monologue has helped to uncover many previously hidden truths about the rich cultural diversity of Africa and the undeniable impact of Black history. In some ways, this has contributed to reversing centuries of intentional hiding and obfuscation of Black civilizations and meaningful African innovation. I'm very proud of what I've been able to achieve so far, which brings me to Reconstructing Egypt. I'm fully aware of the potential impact of my choice to author such a book. I'm clear on my goal, its potential to reach and impact millions. I know that I need to release this book to be able to access a world beyond social media. I also think the timing is crucial. In a year where anti-Black sentiment, anti-Black authorship, the legalized erasure of Black history and accusations of Afrocentrism are all coordinating to attack, undermine and erase even more of our history, it has become clear that racism in social and academic spaces is far from abating. This threat continues to grow. Last year, I began the arduous task creating academic texts, website archives, and obviously continued to draft original research pieces and documentaries, all whilst working full-time. This year, it became very clear to me that it was time to unify my research and reconstructions into a written volume. Documenting our history as it stands is important, as the evidence of melanated contributions continue to disappear. In addition to this, as nations in the Southern Hemisphere continue to reduce their colonial dependencies on the West, so too will the schooling and academic institutions need to develop a base of educational resources built on indigenous ideals, and not on the fabricated legacy left by Western imperialism. New resources are needed. Fortunately, I don't need to start from scratch. Reconstructing Egypt will stand on the shoulders of the great researchers of the past, whilst leaning heavily into my own research, written articles, documentaries, and digital publications. It will also encompass recent developments in anthropology where relevant. I will obviously lean heavily on my specialisms in digital reconstructions, forensic arts, and physical anthropology. Similar to the academic paper I authored in 2024, this book will expose the hidden agenda behind many of the forensic reconstruction projects commissioned by the Department of Egyptian Antiquities. Being a visual learner myself, the book is illustration rich, containing all of my reconstruction work. This illustrative approach will make it broadly accessible to all ages. I will likely create stretch goals in the form of enhanced print fidelity and complementary additional chapters. So, if you are passionate about preserving our history, why not pre-order a copy or two and help me reach my goal of developing this book? There's a very affordable digital version available for those not too bothered about owning a physical copy. One thing's for sure, none of the progress made in the past few years has been me acting in isolation. Since I launched The King's Monologue, the community support has been immense, so I'd obviously like to thank my several patrons, community members, website donators, subscribers and followers for taking me this far. I'm sure that together we'll continue to take ownership of our history and have the resources to teach our stories from our perspective to the next generation without resistance.
So that brings us to the end of this video. I hope you found it informative. It was a hell of a lot of work, but if you have found it informative, do me a favor and just make sure that you're subscribed. And if you really found value in it, consider joining one of my patrons or becoming a channel member, or even going to my website and dropping a donation. All of these things can really help the continued research that we continue to undertake on The King's Monologue. I'd like to give a big, massive shout out actually at this point to those of you who have stopped by the website and bothered to drop a donation. Names going on the screen right now. I'd obviously like to give a massive shout out to my production team and Patreon, and also my general Patreon supporters and members. I appreciate you. And my channel members. All of you are massively appreciated. Your support is noted, required and needed. And yeah, make sure you click on another video. Don't just leave the channel. And if you found this informative, we've got much more like it on the channel. And I think at that point, we'll wrap this up and I'll see you on the next one. Peace.